The Berlin Wall was an unspeakable tragedy. It divided many families and the lack of freedom was immense. When the wall fell, it was a triumph for the people of Berlin as well as Germany. A few years later, the east and west side of both Germany and Berlin were reunited. By 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed and communism had been abolished from Eastern Europe. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones based on the outcome of the Yalta Conference in 1945. The Americans and the Soviet Union had been allies during World War II, but after the war it became clear that the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, had no interest in holding up his part of the bargain agreed to in the Yalta Conference. The 2 countries became Cold War enemies. The Americans, the British, and the French controlled the west side of Berlin and the West German zones, and in 1949 they decided to merge their land together to form the Federal Republic of Germany, otherwise known as West Germany. Unfortunately, Berlin was too far into the communist Soviet sector, which became known as the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. Prior to the Allies joining their zones of occupation, the Soviet Union blocked off all the routes into Berlin so that the supply lines would be disrupted. On June 24, 1948, the Americans flew over planes and dropped supplies for the West Berlin people. They continued to do this until May 12, 1949. This was known as the Berlin Airlift. Many people in East Berlin didn't want to live under communist rule, and they continually escaped into West Berlin to be free and reunite with their families. In response to the flood of people leaving, the East Berlin government erected a barbed wire fence in the middle of Berlin on August 13, 1961, which began the first stage of the wall. But the people of Berlin didn't let this stop them. There were many people that jumped over or crawled through the barbed wire. Eventually, the barbed wire fence was replaced by a brick wall. Some people during this time got to the other side by jumping out of windows, but eventually the windows that were near the wall were blocked off by bricks. The wall was somewhat temporary at first, but evolved into a permanent concrete barrier. In October of 1961, there was a 16-hour standoff at Checkpoint Charlie between tanks of the Soviet Union and the Americans and their Western allies. Luckily, no shots were fired during this event. In 1963, President Kennedy gave a speech in West Berlin to show that the Americans were committed to German reunification.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The Berlin Wall was 91 miles long and was almost 12 feet tall. It split the city of Berlin in half. The Berlin Wall ran right through the middle of the city and caused great despair. This tragedy split many families apart, and many people died trying to cross the wall. The journey to cross the wall was pretty much a death wish. There were 2 walls with minefields in between. That was called the death strip. There were even watchtowers with guards armed with machine guns to make sure no one escaped to West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was a cause of great tyranny for many. Imagine yourself not being able to go to the grocery store because there was a huge wall, guards, and minefields in the way, or not being able to wave to your family because if you did, you would get shot at. In one instance, 2 men, 22-year-old father Siegfried Nofke and his friend Dieter Hotker dug tunnels to be with their families, but one of their wives betrayed them and they were caught by East German police. Nofke was shot to death and Hotker was put in prison for 10 years. To top it all off, his wife divorced him while in prison. There was also the story of a 6-year-old, Andreas Sink, who was pushed into the Spree, a river forming part of the barrier between East and West Berlin. This was a well-guarded area, but none of the East German guards took interest in helping the little boy. Unfortunately, there were numerous reports of people drowning while trying to escape East Berlin. 18-year-old Peter Fechter and his friend Helmut Kolbeek were desperate to see their families. They attempted to climb the wall near Checkpoint Charlie. and were only a few feet away from the west side when Fector was shot in the pelvis. This event was watched by hundreds of people, but they couldn't do anything because he was still in East Berlin. He bled to death after about an hour of being ignored by East German police. The East German government, along with the rest of Eastern Europe, was majorly influenced by the Soviet Union. When pro-democracy protests occurred in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Soviet Union sent soldiers and tanks to put down the protests and end the reforms. These events demonstrated the brutal rule of the Soviet Union and the puppet governments that were in place throughout Eastern Europe, including East Germany. It was clear that democratic reforms and demonstrations were met with harsh consequences. In 1985, United States President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Union General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev met each other for the first of several summits. They talked about international diplomatic issues and developed a close relationship. From the time he took office in 1985 through the collapse of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev continually pushed for economic and political reforms. He specifically pushed for glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, which meant reform. On June 12, 1987, President Reagan addressed the issue of the Berlin Wall in a very powerful speech that he gave in front of the Brandenburg Gate.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In the spring of 1989, when pro-democracy demonstrations began in East Germany, Erich Honecker, the East German leader, asked for Soviet support, similar to what had happened in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. But Mikhail Gorbachev didn't intervene because he felt that communism needed to be reformed. In 1989, Gorbachev announced that the relations with the West had changed. He began easing travel restrictions across Eastern Europe. East Germans began leaving the country through the relaxed borders of Austria and Hungary to see their families once again. In the fall of 1989, frequent demonstrations occurred at the Berlin Wall. Erich Honecker resigned as East German leader in October. At midnight on November 9, 1989, thousands of people flooded the checkpoints. The wall had been breached.
I don't think walls work because walls are always breached. Whenever you build a wall, people want to get over it, they want to get under it, they want to get through it. And so for me, the fall of the Berlin Wall is really a testament to the triumph of human ingenuity. Right? People were going to tear that wall down, even if they had to go themselves with hammers and chisels and bring it down. The wall had been breached hundreds of times by all of these people who refused to take no for an answer and said, we're going to get over that wall. And if you see it not as a one-time event, but as the culmination of years and years of decades of people saying, no, we refuse to accept this, I see it as a triumph of human will, of human ingenuity, of human passion to be free.
That weekend, more than 2 million East Berliners visited the West. The wall was gradually taken down by the East German government. Some pieces of the wall remain on display, and others were taken by protesters when the wall came down. On October 3, 1990, the German Democratic Republic became part of the Federal Republic of Germany to create a reunited Germany. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union had been disbanded and communist rule had ended. As for Berlin, it became one city again, and the symbol of Cold War division and tragedy had been overcome by the willpower to be free by the people of Berlin.